Good morning. We are corresponding to the Ayin Beis, Volume 2, page 1158. We are on page 164 in Hemshech Tzadik Dalet. Okay. So, we're discussing the level of Ayin be'emtza, which is the interface, the divine interface between Yesh Amiti and Yesh Nivra, the creator, the ultimate Yesh, the ultimate and true and absolute existence, as we learned, and the Yesh Nivra, the created existence. And there's a bridge in order to connect the two, the interface, what he calls the Ayin Hamamutza, Hamachaber, that connects them. That Ayin is a state of opposite of Yesh. Yesh is a state of existence. It's true, Atzmus, you can't call existence, you call Bilti Metzius Nimsa, but it's still the ultimate existence. Amiti Simotzei, in the words of the Rambam, the true existence. In the words of Ayin Beis and Chassidus, Bilti Metzius Nimsa, Yesh Amiti. So we say Yesh there, you're not meaning a Metzius as we understand Metzius, but the ultimate reality. The Yesh Nivra is the Metzius created by this ultimate reality, called the Yesh, created as a Yesh, not as an Ayin. It's not created in a state of Bittul, it's created in a state of Yesh that senses itself as an independent identity, independent consciousness, and that's why the whole process of a tzimtzum, we spoke about Shayuchad V'Amunah Shemesh Shemogan Hashem Elokim, the Mogen, the sheath, so-called a type of cloak that cloaks and conceals the divine in order to create the Yesh Nivra. The goal is, the purpose is, that the Yesh Nivra should come, through its work and Avodah, should come to recognize that it truly is a creation of God's, and it lives up to the purpose for which God created it, to create a Dira B'Tachtenim. The Ayin Be'emtza is an Ayin precisely because it is the tool and essentially the bridge which connects the two. So from Atzmus' point of view, not that God, Atzmus needs to create it, but it gives us an understanding of how God creates existence. It doesn't just jump from Yesh Amiti to Yesh Nivra. It goes through this process that first God chooses to manifest his Eir. Eir is the name used in Kabbalah and especially in Chassidus. It's just a word. It's not actual light and it's not actual energy as we know it. It's just a way of expressing divine expression. Say Elikus, Eir Eliki. So now Elikus has come into some form of manifestation. And that manifestation will go through many stages till it reaches the tzimtzum, and then the tzimtzum will conceal it, and then comes a kav, and then comes the seder ishtalshus as we know it, until the light, the energy, the Eir is so diminished, the ayin, that it can become an ayin of the Yesh Nivra, which fits in and is tailored to create existence. So if you look at the bottom of the rung, where we are, the Eir is at its most concealed state, as he says in Tanya, chapter 36, in other words, it's the lowest in concealment, the deepest possible concealment is this existence. As you climb from the bottom up, we now have a method to, because we have a ladder, we have a bridge, we climb backwards, we're working from the most concealment to less concealment and less concealment and less concealment, more revelation as we climb in our journey, each one of us according to our state of where we are, until we can reach all the way to those highest levels that connects us to the source itself. Now, if to remember, just for the record, since I'm already giving this overview, there's the concept of in Sherish Mitzvahs Atfilah, the Tzemach Tzedek cites the Shal Shel Tshuvas Rivosh, where the one of the scholars tells the Makubal, he says to him, you talk about all the spheres, and so on. Ani mispal l'daze hatinuk. I pray straight to God like the daze hatinuk, to the same intention as the child has. A child doesn't know about this whole Seder Shtalshus. When a child says, Baruch Hashem, Moida Ani, any other connection, it doesn't go through any levels. A child speaks straight to Atzmus. So the Rebbe explains at length that, of course, there's that aspect that a ish pashut and a child can speak straight to Atzmus. But if you want it to be internalized and integrated in a way that is, we can say it's become who we are, not just we're reaching, there you need that whole in-between. Not because the in-between, God forbid, we're praying to the Shetach, which is the whole point there in Sheresh Mitzvah Tefillah. We don't pray to the Shetach, we pray to God. But we relate to God through his attributes. You know, there's chesed, you know, there's gvura, and you find chesed and gvura in your life. So you can connect your details and the structure as well. And the ultimate goal is the combination that the yesh uses the ayin to sublimate itself, to refine itself, and slowly acclimate itself to more and more of the divine, to the point that we become completely connected to it. So where we are now is focusing on the ayin itself. What is this ayin like? Because the more we understand the ayin be'emtza, the more we have tools to work with it. So we explained that the ayin, as I said, divides into two. Right now, which is one that relates more to atzmus, to the yesh amiti, called the ayin amiti, and there's the other level that reaches the second level of ayin, which is all part of one ayin, oir. The oir, as it manifests and relates to the yesh hanivra. Those two ayins have different meaning, which we'll get back to when we finish this whole discussion. The first level of ayin is complete nullification. Its whole role is bittul. That's it. The second level of ayin, you can't call complete nullification because it's the ayin of the yesh hanivra, so it exists, but it is of a different substance of the yesh, as well as it's not musig, it's not understandable. So the ayin of the yesh hanivra teaches us to climb and reach from a yesh state to some form of refinement, some form of a selflessness. The ayin of the yesh amiti teaches us about God, because its entire Metzius is bittul. So then he began to explain, he explained different ways to explain that level of ayin. Three different, we went over it yesterday, earlier. He speaks about where is this ayin placed? Where is this ayin geographically, so to speak, placed in the whole picture? So he explained that it's three different interpretations, and Ayin Beis, he actually said we're focusing on the third. But the Kavana Khan, he calls it in Ayin Beis. But regardless, the three, one is all before the Tzimtzum. Before the Tzimtzum itself, there's subtly, as we've discussed, it's not actual levels, but so to speak, for us to speak about its levels relative to Atzmos that goes through the stages of Etzem Me'er and Ispashtus Ha'er. Etzem Me'er is reflection of the source itself. It's like the level 3 that we're learning now. Ispashtus Ha'er is already as the Eir begins to relate Hashayach elements. It's not actual relates to the worlds yet, but relatively speaking, it's an Eir that's beginning where the Ratzon begins to emerge, and the Shir Atzmei Bekeach, where God is allocating that. The second interpretation in Ayin is the Ayin is Sevav Kalam. It's the Eir Makif. Or you can say the Eir before the Tzimtzum is the Ayin of the Yesh Amiti, and Sevav and Memala Kalalman is the Ayin of the Yesh Nivra. The Memala Kalam begins with the Kav, and the Eir that enters, we call the immanent energy as opposed to the transcendent energy. So it's the transcendent and the immanent. And the third interpretation, which the Rebbe Rashab says, the Kavona Khan, meaning that speaking primarily about the third, is the Imamala Kalam in itself. There's the Kav, and then there's the Eir that enters into each creation. And he says even deeper is the Etzem and Ispashtus of Eir Mamala. In other words, the Kavona El Yena, why God created Eir HaGvul, and then there's the Eir HaGvul as it actually manifests what he calls Primius and Chetzenis Eir. Okay. Then he went on to explain that there's two meanings, that, as I said before, the different order, that the Ayin has two different meanings. The Ayin of the Yesh Amiti has one meaning, and the Ayin of Yesh Nivra has second meaning. And then from there, he went in and said, now, the bittul that we're talking about of Ayin is not just how Atzmus sees the Ayin of the Yesh Amiti, but the Ayin itself is saturated with, is defined by bittul. So the Ayin itself carries that bittul. It's not just how God sees it that way. And there he began to say there's 3 levels of bittul, which leads us to where we are. The first level is the bittul of because in the presence, it's attached, Veikus ba'amoy, it's attached to the source, and it senses it. So therefore, it's nullified in the presence like a candle before, in the light of the sun. So there the is already somewhat of a separate entity, but it's nullified in the presence. The second level is the Metzius itself, Ein zu lascha. There's no other. The Metzius of the itself senses that it is completely dependent on, and therefore does not exist without the source. No source, no Oir. And the third is that even with Atzmus, there's no Metzius of Oir. All you have is the reflection and expression of Atzmus. And that is what the highest level in the bittul of Ayin. And the 3 levels now he's explaining correspond to the 3 levels in the 3 Oiris. The Oir HaKol Ba'atzmusei, the Oir as it's encompassed in its source. In general, that's the Oir Lifnei HaTzimtzum, including the Esser Spheres Hagnuzas, the 10 hidden spheres. The second level is the Oir as it already is after the Tzimtzum. So he calls this, they're beginning to take on definition, but they're not yet tangible. Blima, they're not without substance. And then the Oiris in the Kelim. As the Oiris manifests in the Kelim, become tangible. He calls the 3 Metzius, Kiyum, and Gilui. The 3 levels, existence, but he explained it's an existence that's barely an existence. It's an existence only because it's not Atzmus. But on the other hand, it's not Atzmus. As he said, it's that in-between place. The second level is called Kiyum. He calls it Kiyum because there you already have some substantial element. Kiyum as in the term Kayum. It's standing strong. It's manifest in some way. And then finally, Gilui, it gets revealed through the Eris and the Kelim. Okay. Now, the example he gave to explain the difference between Yochid and Echad, between the highest level of Bittul and the second was first Koyach HaTnua, power of movement. He explained the 3 levels in movement. There's the etzem fact that every living entity is movable, is a moving entity. That's like the Koyach HaYuli, he called that a Koyach HaYuli. Koyach HaYuli al kol amine tnuas. Then comes the tnuas, begins in general terms. You already have the different movement between the head, the body, and the leg. And then the actual specific movements of each specific, like say writing an aleph and a beis. And all 3 are connected, obviously. They flow from one another, but they're different stages. And he explained the highest level is like Yochid, the second level is Echad. He didn't define the 3rd level, but that seems to be Prati. So Pratim, Yochid, Echad, and Pratim. Okay. Now, where we are now, 164, after explaining these 3 levels of Eris that I just mentioned, Metzius, Kiyum, and Gilui, and this is the Oir HaKol, again, the Oir, that energy that's encompassed in the source. So basically, it's just a reflection of the source. The second is already an independent entity, but it's not yet fully established. It's established, but that's Kiyum, but it's not yet revealed in a structured way. And then the level that is structured, so he began to explain it. He said that he says that 3rd level that we just described, Eris and Kelim, is be'erech klal, is not commensurate at all to the 1st level. And he gave the example of the difference between Chachmas HaMaisa and Chachmas HaNefesh. That's where we're middle of discussing the difference. So what is the difference between that? One is, they're both wisdom and profound wisdom, but one is a wisdom that relates more to the action. So as I said, it's the wisdom of the artist as we see it in his art. And then there's the wisdom of understanding the artist, the Chachmas HaNefesh, the art, the nefesh of the, which he said is much higher. The way Chachmas HaMaisa sounds to me very much like Tenua, movement. It's the Chachma, let's say, of drawing, of writing. And Chachmas HaNefesh is more the nefesh that is the one that's doing the writing. He doesn't say this explicitly, but it sounds to me that it's like that. But regardless, so he says, I'm going to start from the line on page 164 that says, Actually, the line starts, he says, from the line Mikalim Shenim, I'll just go a little earlier, but we'll go over this piece. So after explaining the three levels, the third one being in Kalim, Mikalim, they're all inside containers and vessels. He says, that the third level is it's not commensurate at all to the air that's in the state of Metzius. Remember, Metzius Kiyum Gil, the first level, which is the first level. And now he explains, like we see it, as it is, similar to the way it is in the faculties of the soul, the soul's faculties. So in the Keiches HaNefesh, the power of intelligence, that comes in a complete understanding, a comprehension, an understanding of physical thing in the wisdom of, I call it craftsmanship, or the wisdom of action, the wisdom connected to something that you're building. So as powerful as the Eira Seichel is in this Chochmas HaMaisa, it doesn't come close, he says, to how it is in the Seichel and the Chochmas HaNefesh, where you're involved with understanding something that's nafshizdik. Nafesh is already something sublime and ruchni. Whereas Chochmas HaMaisa is, at the end of the day, you're understanding a type of physical art or a physical craft. And here he introduces level 3. So we also learned that higher than Chachmas HaNefesh is something even more, which is Seichel as it's still in its potential state. It's not even a Seichel. Chachmas HaNefesh is an active intelligence. It's the study of the soul. It's the study of the psychology, which is the study of the soul. But then the Seichel Hiyuli, it's not even a Seichel. It's a potential in the Nefesh. There's a power that has the potential to become Seichel, like Koyach HaMaskil. And then we learned even earlier it was higher than that Koyach Hiyuli HaAtzmi, which is what he's mentioning here. If you remember the two different ways to access these two levels, he doesn't distinguish between Koyach HaMaskil and Koyach was like the difference between the coal, the hot coal, and the flintstone. Hanatua Mushus Be'etzem HaNefesh, which is Natua, is implanted and rooted in the Etzem HaNefesh. So here we have Chochmas HaMaisa, Chochmas HaNefesh, and Seichel Yuli HaNatua Be'etzem HaNefesh. So he says the lowest level, Chochmas HaMaisa, is not commensurate at all to Chochmas HaNefesh, and for sure not to the way Seichel is in its Koyach Yuli. So that's a general, okay, that's where we stop. We'll continue from Omnom, Zeu Ba'eres B'chlal. This is in general, when you talk about Eir, no matter what Eir you're talking about these three stages. It starts from a Koyach Yuli Atzmi, then it goes to like a Chochmas HaNefesh, as he calls it, and then Chochmas HaMaisa, which it sounds like these are the three levels that he's talking about, like the Eir HaKolul, which is encompassed in the Nefesh. The next is it's already emerging, but it's still a very sublime state, Chochmas HaNefesh. And Chochmas HaMaisa is as it comes into actual functionality, the wisdom of actionability, execution, building something, crafting something, drawing something. So he says, this is an Eres B'chal, v'cheinu b'chol Eir B'frat. And the same is true also with every Eir B'frat, every specific Eir, the Yesh B'ei Gimlin Yonim Hanal, that has the three components that we spoke about earlier, Metzius, Kiyum, Gilui. I'm trying to understand what does he mean by Eres B'chlal and every Eir B'frat. Wasn't he talking before also about Eres B'chlal? That all the Eres have Eres HaKolul, then the Eres HaDes, Chol Eir B'frat. The way I would understand Er Befrat would be, let's say, Er HaChochmeh, Er HaBina, as opposed to just a general all Eris. That's what it sounds like he means by Klal Prat. But maybe we'll understand it once he explains it. Because he didn't make a distinction. He was just talking in general. Er starts in one state, the next state, all Eris. So he's saying that every Er, all Er is Metzius, Kiyum, and Gilui. Those are the words that he used at the bottom of page 161. He says, Biri in Shiur Gimel Madregas Be'eris. And earlier he said, Kol Er yesh bei Gimel Inyanim. Okay, probably what I'm saying is correct. There's Er in general, meaning the whole process of Er, and then there's the Er Befrat of each specific level. That's what I think he means. Yeah. Tiyesh beGimel Inyanim Hanal, Metzius, Kiyum, v'Gilui. Shebeklulusa, now he's going to give them a new name. He's introducing another way of explaining these three levels. Shebechlalusin, in general, Hein Gimel B'chinas, they're the three levels of Nekudah, Kav, v'Shetach. Nekudah, Kav, v'Shetach. A point, a line, and a plane. In mathematical terms, a point is just a dot, a kav is a line, and a shetach is a plane. It has 3 dimensions. Meaning, well, I don't say 3 dimensions. It has a nekudah does not have length, erech or rechev, doesn't have length or width. That's what a nekudah is. A line has length but no width, and a plane has length and width. That's what I should have said. Not 3 dimensions, length and width. So we always see it. The first thing you study in geometry is that point, line, plane, and it explains a line is made up of infinite points and a plane is made up of infinite lines. I don't know if infinite lines is correct, but they're made up of lines. So many lines, you put them together side by side, you create a plane. So a plane, essentially, a square is a plane, a rectangle is a plane, a triangle is a plane. So it has length and width. Okay. Obviously, in 3-dimensional, you add a 3rd dimension, depth. But that's not relevant right here. Nekudah Kav Shetach. Now, Nekudah Kav Shetach is going to now explain is the difference between Metzius, Kiyum, and Gilui. So we have quite a few references to explain these 3 levels. And now, you may recall in Ayin Beis, volume 1, he spoke about Nekudah Kav Shetach, I believe, like in chapters 30 or something like that. Let me just see. A little later, maybe. Nekudah Kav Shetach. I think it's in the 30s somewhere, if I recall correctly. Yeah, it's earlier. All right, chapter 31. Gimel Madregas, Gimel B'chinas Nekudah Kav Shetach. Okay. Good. In case you're looking for references. So now, the difference between the 3. The Nekudah who when you say a nekudah by definition, even mathematically, does not have occupied space. That's why there's infinite points in a line. A line can be 1 inch or 1,000,000 inches. It says there's infinite points in the line because a point is really a conceptual figure. It doesn't exist in reality because any point has some measurement. Maybe a micromillimeter, but it's something there. So Nekudah is really in math considered to be an abstract concept. But in Chassidus, Nekudah, as he's saying here, is a state where it's concentrated in a state where it's beyond, the words again, Lamailam, Atzmus, it's the core of something, the essence of something, that's Lamaila Dayan, it's still above from any Hamshacha V'Gili. Now, to say nothing exists, you can't say. And Nekudah does not mean nothing exists. You can't say it's any form of extension or transmission and revelation. Ukumaya and Nekudah. Like when you look at an actual Nekudah, you see a dot, a point. She'ein bo adayin hispashtus erech v'rechev. It doesn't yet have an extension of length and width. Ukumaya eis yud. Shehu Nekudah. Like the letter yud. The yud is a Nekudah. Now I know when we write a letter yud in the Sefer Torah, it's not just a dot. It has it's a body, and it has a tag lamaila and it has a tag lamata. If you look at a yud, the yud isn't just a dot; it has shape. But Chassidus explains that shape is because we need to define it in this world in some way. But in essence, it represents Nekudah. And in the Nekudah, there's also some details. But technically speaking, we're not talking about a yud in the Sefer Torah, which does have length and width. If you just make a dot, it's a apostle letter. A yud has to have a certain shape and form. But essentially, a yud in its root is a Nekudah. Compared to other letters, it's a point, it's a dot. The ima yes, now he's qualifying. And even though to be yud hari b'miluyay, when you spell out a yud is made up of 3 letters. Yud, Vav, Daled. So you know the word milui. Milui means to fill in. So in the Kabbalah, and Chassidus explains, a milui means sometimes you count a word, not just Yud is number 10, letter is 10. But when you spell it out, Yud, Vav, Daled, it adds up to 20. So sometimes when you talk about a letter, the letters also, you go b'miluyay, which means also as you spell them out. Like, for example, all the four names of God that we talk about, Shema, Ban, Sag, and Ab, are all b'miluyim. Because Havaya, Yud-Kei, Vav-Kei is 26. It's not 45. It's not 52. It's not 63. It's not 72. So where do you get those numbers from? Is because if you write out Yud-Kei, Vav-Kei, you can write it out several ways. Yud, Vav, Dalet is 20. Hey, Aleph is one way, is 6. 26. Vav, Aleph, Vav is 13. That's 39. And then again 6. That's 45. Hey, Aleph, the last hey. The same thing when you do Shem Sag is b'milui Vavin. And then the b'milui hey, I'm sorry, not b'milui Hey. And then Shem Ab is b'milui Yud, Hey Yud, instead of Hey Aleph. The Yud Vav Dalet is always the same. The point I'm just making is to give context. So he says now, the ima yes, the Yud, you're just telling me the Yud is a higher than Hispashtus and Gilui, in any way of length and width, but the Yud is b'milui yesh Vav Dalet. The Yud has a Vav Dalet with it. So it's not completely a Yud. Shem Erech v'Rechev. Vav and Dalet is length and width within the Yud itself, which explains, of course, how we write it in the Sefer Torah. The Vav Meira ala Erech. Vav is always a line, always indicates on length. It's a Vav. A Vav is a line. The Dalet Meira ala Rechev. And the Dalet of Yud, Vav Dalet is not just a line. Dalet also has a width and a line. A Dalet is a line straight and a line horizontal, a vertical and horizontal line. So therefore, you have Yud is the dot, the Kudah point. Vav is length. Dalet is width. Omnom. Now he answers. However, Zeu ba milui. This is only in the milui. This is when you write it out. Shehu helam. I'm sorry. He's answering differently. No, I thought he was going to say this is the milui once you spell it out. But if you don't spell it out, it's just a yud. He's saying, yes, but this is a milui, and a milui is shehu behelam. Because when you write down a letter yud, you don't see the milui. It's when you say it. When I say yud, I'm saying yud vav daled. But when you write yud, you don't write yud vav daled, you write a yud, a dot. So the milui Chassidus explains is a eir nelam. It's encompassed in the yud, but it's not in a revealed state. So he says, milui, meaning how it's written out and how it's filled in. But that's a state of helam because it's not obvious until you spell it out. V'hainu, and this means v'hainu the benekudah hakol b'pshitas hadayin. that in Nekudah, everything is still in a state of shapelessness, meaning you don't have length and width. And the fact there's length and width is encompassed in there, but it's concealed. So we're not saying that the Nekudah does not have the potential to be extended. Obviously, let me finish. Obviously, a Nekudah can then be unpacked. Like we're going to learn in a moment, Chochmah is a Nekudah, but then Bina fleshes it out. So we're not saying the Yud does not have the potential and concealed state, the Vav and the Daled, but what you see and what's obvious, like he says, is the Nekudah. The Nekudah is the dot. That's what you see when you write it down. And within that, concealed is the Vav and Daled. Ulechein, and therefore, Hine Nekudah Sasechel be'efshel lasbira bekama ifanim. Okay, Nekudah Sasechel means, he's now applying it to Sechel. When a person conceives of an idea, there's a flash, a spark of an idea. Nothing developed yet. So if it was developed, then you have the idea, it's spelled out. But he's going to explain now, because it's a Nekudah and it's not yet shaped, even though it has the potential and has it concealed within it, that's why you can explain a Nekudah in many different ways. You can explain it different ways, because it's still in a state of shapelessness. And I'll give an example. In Ayin Beis in the beginning, early on, he spoke about Eiris. He spoke about that Eiris are on their own pshutim. They're shapeless. Different two opinions, whether they're completely shapeless or they have some. So he brought a proof there that it has something in it, because you see that when Shmaya v'Avtalyan, the two great Tanoim, early Tanoim, would teach, and their students were Shammai and Hillel. They learned from Shmaya v'Avtalyan. That's what we learned. Pirkei. So Hillel would hear the words of Shmaya v'Avtalyan, l'chesed. He would derive from their idea, he would derive that it's more lenient approach. And Shammai would hear more chumrah. So the question is, what's going on here? They had the same teachers, they heard the same ideas. How could it be possible that this one took one approach and this one mamish the opposite? One is mutter, one is osir. Has halachic implications even. So it explains, because Shmaya v'Avtalyan spoke like a Nekudis, Hafshota. So they spoke an idea that was not yet shaped one way or another. So it's a concept, and that same concept can be explained in different ways. Now, why is that possible? Because a Nekudah is not yet defined by length and width. It's not yet shaped. So though within it lies the potential, but at the end of the day, he says, because it's pshittis, that's why it can be explained in a number of ways. I could just tell you from my own experience. Sometimes the Rebbe would speak at Fabrengen, say an idea, and later when we would by Chazorah, and when we had to write it, there'd be an argument which sometimes was opposite of what people had different opposite perspective on what the Rebbe said. And when you went back to the Rebbe's words, you could see they could be interpreted both ways. So I once wrote to the Rebbe something and said that we had a different of opinion of how to understand the Fabrengen. Usually we didn't do that. But sometimes it was so glaringly necessary for the Rebbe's clarification. And once the Rebbe wrote, that we wrote, yes, Shnei Efanim, two different ways that we understood the Rebbe, and the Rebbe added, Yesh Leimer B'zeh Oy Daled Hei Efanim. You could say there are another 4 or 5 ways to explain it. And the Rebbe didn't end up explaining it. So I've always been trying to figure out what the other 4 or 5 ways were. But this is when you say Shivim Ponim L'Teira, 70 faces to facets to Teira. So you can take one pasuk and look at Chazal, one pasuk, and you can derive very different things, and sometimes opposites even, from the same pasuk. Now, no one's making a mistake. It's how the pasuk is written in a way that can be interpreted in several different forms. The Rebbe says in Sichos that the Nasi of Adar is Mashiach Shebedar. So some people say the Rebbe is saying he's Mashiach. Other people say the Rebbe didn't say that. So here's a perfect example. The The point being is that Nekudah, it's still beyond specifics, details, and therefore can be interpreted in several ways. Okay. That's Nekudah. Now comes Kav. V'akav, level 2, Hu hamshacha v'gilui. In contrast to the Nekudah, which he said was not hamshacha v'gilui, there was no transmission and no revelation, just a spark, a Nekudah, a particle, a point. Kav is already hamshacha v'gilui. A line is already, something is being drawn down, like we said, the Vav, and some revelation, relatively speaking. However, Rak, yet, Rak, it's only Shahu B'chinas Hamshoche Hiyulis Adayin. Oh, it uses Hiyulis. I thought he was going to use Nelam. Okay. However, the only thing is that this Hamshoche is Hamshoche, but it's still Hiyulis, means it's still in a potential state. So I know I used the word potential on Nekudah. I probably should rephrase that, because the Nekudah, he doesn't call Hiyulis, he calls the Nekudah no Ispashus, no Hamshacha and Gilui. Here there's some Hamshacha, but it's still in a potential state. I'm teaching Hiyuli potential. It's not the only interpretation, but we'll leave it for that. V'hainu, and this means Da'akav ima yes sheyesh bei protim beizgalus. I know there's some letters look cut off, but it looks like sheyesh bei. So even though the kav now, in contrast to the Nekudah, in contrast to the dot or point, even though it has protim beizgalus, it has details that are revealed. That's why it's a kav. It's a long kav. It has length. Makol mokim, since it doesn't have width, it only has length. Harihu b'bchinas harihem, or harihu b'bchinas pshitas adayin. It's still in a state of shapelessness. Or b'bchinas hisachdus, and a state of everything being united as one. So we still have to understand the difference in Nekudah and Kav in this context of pshitus. But let's read what he says, and then we'll see what the Frierdiker Rebbe explains, and then we'll take it from there. So now he's using pshitus, adayin, and hisachdus. Things are all still united or unified. So he's going to explain dehine, because now, in a kav b'derech klal, this line, kav, in general, hu b'chinas ha'erech, is the level of length. That's the level, it's the state of length. What is length? Shu b'chinas ha'gilui. Length is a state of gilui. When something extends, which is maybe the better word, extension. So in the Nekudah, it's all concentrated and concealed. And erech, it's now being drawn. It's like a channel. If you remember, I think he said by Rotzen Sinner, I don't know if you compared it to a Vav, but a Vav is a form of a channel. That's why the shape of a Vav is like that. The Yud is the beginning of point, the point where you begin. And the Kav, if you think about it, is a line that draws it down. Gili. Omnom. Bizeh gufa yesh beze fanim. In this itself, in this eirach, in this length, in this extension, there are two types or two ways that it manifests. Ha'echad, masheprat echad boba hamshocha v'izgalus madrega lemadrega. That one detail comes in a form of transmission and revelation from level to level. In other words, you take a detail and you bring it downward from level to level. And he explains, like the transmission of intelligence, of seichel, of an idea, from a gadol to a cotton. Gadol to cotton, that can mean many things. It can mean an adult and a child. It could also mean a chacham gadol and a chacham cotton. A wiser person and his student and lesser wise. He calls gadol and cotton. But Pashtus Gadol and Katan is usually like a teacher and a child, or adult and a child. But it could be either way. It doesn't change the pshat here. So this hashpah, the Esa Inyan Haproti, Shemashpiyaloi, that the teacher who's transmitting the idea, this Inyan Prati, whatever it is that he's explaining, let's say he's explaining to his student or his child, he's explaining the concept of rain, how it rains outside. So Inyan Prati, it's a specific detail, Shemashpiyaloi, that he transmits to him. Malbishe, this same Inyan Prati, he doesn't go to other subjects. He's sticking to this specific idea. Malbishe b'mashal, he encloses it, he manifests it, he presents it in a mashal with an example, in a mashal, an analogy to explain something that's more of an idea that's hard to understand on your own for the student. Oy be'eze inyan, or a mashal is one way, he can explain it through an example, or he uses some inyan, some idea, mashu be'erech hamakabel, that is commensurate and relates to the recipient, which we do all the time. When you want to explain a certain particular idea, and you need to bring it down, so that same idea, you give a mashal for it. So here's an example. You know, we've been giving an example of an artist. Give an example of the sun and the sunlight. You give an example, or you explain it in terms with another subject matter that the student, the recipient, can understand. And with that, he'll understand the original topic. So either a mashal or another idea that relates to him. But it's all within that inyan prati. That prat is being nimshach. This is what he's calling the first eifin of the kav. You're taking an idea, a prat, a detail, a nekudah, and you're extending it all within that specific detail. You're not expanding it into different subject matters. V'hainu, and this means the idea hamishalim v'ha'inyonim, that through these examples and these inyonim, again, the difference between a mashal and inyan, mashal is an example from, just an example. An inyan, it would be taking another idea and explaining this idea. So he says, Yovin esa inyan haproteahu. Why does he need this? So through these examples and through these comparative inyonim, he'll understand that specific detail that the teacher, that the gadol is transmitting to the katan. Asher kol inyoni shel hamashpia, the whole inyoni, the whole function or the whole role of a mashpia, of a teacher or a mashpia, a transmitter, who lahedid is a muskel bahapratahu. His entire role is to yedid. Lahedid is a muskel, to bring down, to draw down the idea of this detail, in this specific detail, medarge ledarge, from level to level, umalbishe be'ed mashal, and to enclose it or manifest in yet another mashal, another example, achiya inyan muvan, until the point that until it's understood, gam lebal seichel katan beyeser, also to a person who's relatively much lower level of intelligence. So now he's adding, it could be a mashal to a mashal, but it's all one detail. You start with one detail, whatever that is, you want to explain it. This is the role of the mashpiyah. So the role of mashpiyah is to take that nekudah, that prat, that detail, and extend it like a kav by dressing it up in examples, an idea that explains this idea, all in this prat, to the point that it can be explained even to the simplest person, even to someone who has far less intelligence, which is, of course, a good educator can do this. So that's one way he explains the kav. The eirach of the kav, the gilui. So it's a gilui, because if he did not give examples and if he didn't explain it to someone that's on a different level, the nekudah would remain up here, it would never reach the makabel. So think of the kav, the vav is the connection between mashpiyah and makabel. The mashpiyah starts with an idea, a nekudah, a prat. He takes that prat and then extends it through the line by drawing it to the student. Had he not done that, it would remain elusive and beyond the makabel. So essentially, the kav is the connection between mashpia and makabel, and it entails gilui, revealing that detail of that nekudah through examples and other subjects, and other inyanim, explaining all this detail. And we're not digressing, we're focusing only on one prat. Beis, now comes the second eifin, another way, another manner, another type of level of this kav, oirich, gilui. Shakav urak is galos haprotim sheba nekudah. The kav is only revealing the details that are concealed or hidden in the point, in the original nekudah point. V'hainu, what does this mean? The chol hisaskuse hu begili haprotim. The entire involvement, the entire effort is in revealing the details of the spark of the idea that was shared. So you get a spark of an idea and you're trying to dissect it. What does this idea mean? We're not talking about bringing that detail, that nekudah, into a state of hasaga v'havana, comprehension and understanding. Here we're trying to understand what did the teacher, or not the teacher, what did the nekudah saseichel, what does it have within it? What are the details? Again, dissecting it. Let's see where he's going with this before we ask questions. What's the difference? Because he's not finished. This is al derech the Mishne. So we know this in the Shas, we have Mishne and Gemara. The Mishne is from the Tanoim, first generation. The Tanoim shared the Mishne. Mishne is Beloshen Ktsara, Beloshen Kotzer, as the Rambam says. Mishnes are very short, relatively speaking. It's in the Gemara that the Amoraim, the students of the Tanoim, went and elaborated. Now the Gemara also has Braises and other things that are from Tanoim, or the Tanoim themselves explain the Mishnah. But a Mishnah in general is a nekudah compared to Gemara, which is like a kav, because the Gemara elaborates on the Mishnah. So they say, "Ukamoy ha-Mishnah, sheminyonim pratim." The Mishnah consists of detailed, specific details. They're not fully comprehended. That's why you need the Gemara. You'll see every Mishnah after the Mishnah. Rashi will often say in the Mishnah, he'll say on a certain word, ki yalfinon, Gemara. In other words, the Mishnah itself is not understood the expression. It'll say statements, and the Gemara will dissect it and draw out the details. What does that statement exactly mean? Every Mishnah in Gemara is like that. As a matter of fact, when they teach us Gemara the first time, what do? They tell you, look at the Mishnah. When you're learning the Gemara, even if it's 5 pages later, go back to the Mishnah and point, here's the Mishnah, here's the Gemara. So you see the original lashon of the Gemara, the Gemara will cite, and then how it unfolds it or unpacks it. So, why does it have to be unpacked? Because a lot of it is still very concentrated and not clear, not yet comprehensible. Page 165. They're not yet comprehensible until they're explained afterwards in the Gemara, with many different theories and ideas. Actually, I correct myself. I said before that the Mishnayos is the Nekudah and the Gemara is the Kav. That's incorrect. I jumped, I misspoke. Mishnayos, he says, is Izgalos HaPratim Sheba Nekudah. So even though, well, you know what? Before I say I misspoke, let's finish the there before we explain it. So he says the Mishnayos themselves is already a revealed details in the Nekudah, even though, relatively speaking, compared to the next level, the Gemara, it's still not comprehensible. The Hainu Torah Shebiksav. Torah Shebiksav is the Nekudah. That's what he's saying, the written Torah. Because remember, the Mishnayos is also built on Psukim. as the Gemara usually spells out. So the says Torah Shebiksav is the Nekudah. Mishne is already some pratim, but the pratim are not yet understood. The kol mitzvah. Continue on. Every mitzvah, the way it's written in the written Torah, he bekitzer v'nekudah. It's brief and in a concentrated point. V'mishnayis he megalim prote nekudah. And Mishnayis, the Mishne, the different Mishnas, they reveal the details in that Nekudah, which in Chumash, in Torah Shebiksav, is still in a state of brief, Nekudah, or a 1 point. Okay. Now, I know there's a little confusing here. I'm also confused. I thought that he's going to explain Mishne and Gemara as Nekudah, because the bottom line is he finished the Toy Fanim. So I would want to wait to see what he says afterwards. But let's sum up what we learned right now, so it shouldn't be overly confusing, and see what we still need to explain. So he says like this: the Nekudah itself, we learned, is L'mayla Mahamshacha V'Gilui. It's all concentrated in 1 point. It doesn't yet have any extension and revelation. He says, then comes a kav. The kav is Eirech, it's Amshacha V'Gilui. However, it's still in the state of Hiyuli Sadai. So even though the details are revealed, but they're still in a state of Pshitus and Isardus. Then he says, okay, so the kav, that's the kav. There is a Gilui, but it's still in the state of shapelessness is still there. So it's a Gilui compared to the Nekudah, but compared to later stages, it's still in a state of Pshitus and Isardus. And then he says, in that itself, there's 2 ways to explain that. One is that the kav takes a detail, takes the Nekudah, and draws it down in that same prat, takes that prat, not trying to understand the details within the prat, trying to explain that prat itself to someone that is lesser knowledgeable. And you do that through examples and through explanations, through inyanim, like he said, until the point that you bring the Nekudah to every individual, even someone who doesn't yet have Hasaga. But you're not necessarily dissecting and analyzing all the details of that Nekudah. That's the first way of explaining the Eirech of the Kav. The second way is no. We're not talking about bringing it down to people who are or beginners or students or people who are not yet understand it. You're talking about actually going into the Nekudah and dissecting it to reveal what's inside there. And he says, that's the Mishne. That's what the Mishne does. It goes into the prat, the Nekudah of Torah Shebiksav, and it spells it out. But it's still in the state of Pshittus. Remember, he said the Kav still, this Mishne is more revealed than the Torah Shebiksav. But it needs Gemara still to explain it. So now it sounds like the Gemara is going to be Reichiv, expansion, with Shetach, basically. That's what it looks like now when I read it now again. So you have in Torah Shebiksav the Nekudah. There it's not comprehensible at all. You can't base any halacha on a pasuk in Chumash. Take, for example, the famous one with Mechlekes of the Tzdukim. Le'savaru eish b'chol mesh v'sechem. You shall not light fire, or fire shall not lit in all your dwellings. Now, if you take that pasuk literally, which the Tzdukim did without Torah Shebal Peh, without Mishne and Gemara, it means to sit in the dark. You don't light a fire. You sit in the dark. Comes the Mishne and says no. It means do not light a fire. Doesn't mean there should be no fire. You can light it beforehand. Just an example. So in the pasuk it's a Nekudah. In the Mishne it develops it, but it's still, like he says, Ein b'chinas hasaga adayin. So it's Amshache. The Eifin Beis we're talking. It's Amshache, but it's not yet fully developed until in the Gemara. Now he's going to explain the difference between the two Eifanim. So the first Eifin, again, is taking that very Nekudah and trying to explain it to people of a lower level of understanding with examples and so on. The second is actually taking and revealing. The Mishne is not coming to explain Torah Shebiksav for a beginner. The Mishne is trying to analyze what is the Nekudah that Torah Shebiksav says. It's in the topic itself, trying to analyze and dissect the details. The first Eifin is that the teacher is taking one point and explaining it to a student. So it's a different, the Eirach has two different meanings. He's going to now say the difference between the two. And the difference between these two types of Eirach, of extension, of the Vav, of Eirach, Kav, he says, Be'efana Aleph, in the first interpretation, or the first way, Hariyakav, Hu Amshacha, Lebal Seichel, Hu Amshacha, V'Gilui, Prati Mugbul. It's Amshacha, V'Gilui, Prati Mugbul. It's a transmission and a revelation of a specific and defined topic. You're taking one point, how it descends and goes downward from level to level, to the point that you can take this point and it should be understood by even a Baal Seichel Katan B'Yeser, even someone who's much lower in intelligence, like a beginner, a child, a student, an early student, a beginner student. But in contrast, even though it's also the meaning of kav erech, extension, length of a line, but this is like a kav that's made up of nekudis. It's not one nekudah that you're explaining to lower levels. The kav itself is made up of nekudis, of many points. Interesting way of putting it. Which means the im hayeshe kav hamagala prate nekuda, even though it is a kav because it's an extension from the nekuda that's revealing the details in the initial original point. But also these details that the Mishne, like the example the Mishne is explaining, are still in a state of shapelessness and still potential. They need even further development. In the first Eifin, the whole point is that it doesn't need further development. Why? Because you're taking one nekudah and you're explaining it, you're bringing it down to the recipient. In the second approach, what you're doing is dissecting the nekudah. The kav is, it's the process of dissecting and understanding what's in the original point. This itself is made up of nekudahs. So relatively speaking, though it's a kav compared to the first nekudah, Mishne is like a kav compared to the pasuk in the Torah Shebiksav, but compared to a lower level, it's still in a state of nekudahs and points, and the Gemara will be the one that develops it. That's the difference between these two Eifanim. K'may prate ha-Mishne, like the details that are in the Mishne, Hagam Shem is Galus ha-Nekudah de Torah Shebiksav, even though they're the revelation of the point in Torah Shebiksav, in the written Torah, Aval Gam Heim Pshutim Adayin, but they're still in a state of shapelessness relatively. Asher Zeu Ashak V'Tarya B'Asfara Shebegemara, and that's where the Gemara enters. And this is the Shaka V'Tarya, the back and forth and deliberation in the Sfaris, in the theories, in the Gemara, as the Gemara is trying to analyze the Mishnah, Lahagbil haprotim hamuvorim ba'Mishnah, to define, to some way contain and explain and define. Lahagbil here means to limit, Lahagbil is limit, but here means more also to define and confine the details that are explained in the Mishnah. So you have Torah Shebiksav, Mishnah, Gemara. And the Mishnah is Vav that is drawing out from the Torah Shebiksav, but it's still Pshutus, and that's why you need the deliberations and the discussions and the arguments and counter-arguments in the Gemara. V'hainu. And this means the chol hapratim are yeshnam k'may sheklulim b'nekudah. In other words, all the details are there. I guess in the Mishne he means here. The way they're encompassed in the Nekudah. V'akav megala, or no. The chol hapratim are yeshnam k'may sheklulim b'nekudah in Torah shebiksav. Yeah. All the details are included the way they're encompassed in the initial point. V'akav megala hapratim. The kav, which is a line, which is made up of nekudas. We know a kav is made up of points. So that reveals the details. Aval im zeh, but together with that, simultaneously, hine hapratim hamizgalim ha'idei kav, the details that are revealed through the line, ha'osim in nekudas, which is made up of more points, which are still nekudas, hein b'pshituson adayin. They're still somewhat abstract, somewhat removed from real tangible details. Okay, so we'll stop here. He's going to continue now to continue this explanation. It's a pretty lengthy explanation where he's going to explain. So what's the difference between the pshitus of the kav and the pshitus of the nekudah? What's the difference between the way the nekudas are in the Mishne, which is more than the way it is in the written Torah, and the pshitus of it is in the original nekudah in the written Torah, using this example. But I don't want to rush it, so we'll stop here. We're on top